Hi everyone, welcome to your lecture on cultural rhetoric in games. So to recap last week, we talked about some ideas around simulation and representation. The idea that games simulate behaviour, but the map is not the territory. When we make a representation, not everything gets in. What gets left out and who decides what gets left out can impact the persuasive communication potential of games. And we explored this idea in our lecture on serious games. So looking at how the procedures of the game can communicate messages and how this is tied into the educational and persuasive potential of video games as an educational medium. So in this lecture, we're going to be looking a bit more into kind of politics in commercial games and how some examples of commercial games convey messages and make claims about the world. In thinking through these ideas, will strengthen your ability to think through some of the ways that the play of the serious game that you're coming up with an idea for can be part of the educational potential of that serious game. Talking about this topic brings us into a kind of really stupid debate in gaming culture that games aren't political. Here's a game development interview with Call of Duty developers bending over backwards to say that the game is not political.
I don't think it's a political game.
Really?
But the thing is that people read into that in different ways, right?
Yeah, that's a tough, what do you mean by political?
That doesn't mean anything, right? The question, is this a political game, doesn't actually mean anything because it's what does the word political mean to you? Do we touch topics that bear a resemblance to the geopolitics of the world we live in today? Hell yeah, because this is that is the subject matter of modern warfare. Are we telling a story that has anything to do with the specific governments of any countries that we are portraying? No, right? So if you're asking is Trump in the video game? No, he isn't. Right? It's not. That's not.
These are sort of like time.
In this really narrow, it was through this really narrow interpretation of what being political means that these Call of Duty developers try to get around this question of are games political. Here's a synopsis of the game's story, and you can tell me if you think that this is a political game. Ultranationalists seize control of the Russian Federation and begin a campaign of revenge against the West by committing acts of terrorism on European and international soil over the course of 5 years. As a soldier fighting against these terrorists, you employ a number of very violent measures to overthrow this foreign government. This isn't just a Call of Duty thing. Blizzard's Jeff Kaplan described in response to this debate spoke about Overwatch as being in no way do we aspire to be a political game. We have no political motivations whatsoever. The director of Detroit Become Human, David Cage, stated, "I don't want to deliver a message to mankind with this game. I just want to ask questions." EA emailed a baffling statement of advice in Battlefield 5. We're not making any political statements in relation to real life events of World War II, and there are no swastikas in the game. In Tom Clancy's The Division 2, the creative director Terry Spear stated, "So the goal isn't to make a political statement. It's not to reflect on any things that are happening in the current world, in the live world." And to another journalist at Polygon, he claimed, "We're definitely not making any statements." No matter how these themes are handled, these games are about a multinational peacekeeping force in Overwatch, an android uprising in a real city with a real history of racism, and an actual world war. They depict scenes such as this. This is from Tom Clancy's The Division 2. A reminder, the goal here isn't to make a political statement, reflect on any of the things that are happening in the current world or the live world. Let's have a look at a scene from this game.
Alpha.
I thank you, my guys, thank you, and the people of New York.
Even more Twitch Prime, dude, it doesn't stop. The Twitch Prime trains are fucking real.
That's right, in Tom Clancy's The Division 2, a game, by the way, released in February 2019, depicts a post-pandemic militia storming the Capitol building, making it their stronghold. Your role as a player is to go in and eradicate this ambiguously fascist organization that has taken control of the US Capitol building. So again, the goal here isn't to create a political statement. They're doing an exceptional job of doing it. We can see the immediate contrast between the game and real life just recently. The point here is that games are political. Arguing that they're not political is a political thing to do. It's a defense of the status quo. Their stories, themes, and characters are political. And this lecture is going to discuss how the gameplay of the games is political too. It's not just that these are representing games in their representing warfare in a positive light, the need for kind of interventional forces to defeat enemies, and omitting aspects such as the soft power and counterterrorism work that goes on through organizations like the CIA and overthrowing over 20 governments in South America over the last 50 years, right? What I'm going to be focusing on this lecture is how it is that the gameplay of games is political too, not just those stories, themes, and characters. Okay, so to kind of jump back to, this is a quote from Ian Bogost, who introduced that idea of procedural rhetoric, who claims video games are not just stages that facilitate cultural, social, or political practices. They are also media where cultural values themselves can be represented, for critique, for satire, education, or commentary. When understood in this ways, we can learn to read games as having these deliberate expressions of particular perspectives. These can be unconscious aspects of a game's ideology or consciously designed into the game. A relatively kind of obtuse and obvious one is the game Resistance: Ethnic Cleansing, which was created by a white nationalist organization, National Alliance. This game simulates a race war. Controlling a neo-Nazi or Klansman, the player kills very stereotypical African-American, Latino, and Jewish enemies. On the very much opposite end of the spectrum, we can look at propaganda games like other propaganda games like Darfur is Dying, which was created by Susana Ruiz as an advocacy tool about the humanitarian crisis in Darfur. In the first mode, you're traveling to a well to get water, trying to hide from gingerweed militia. And in the second mode, you're using water to manage a refugee camp, which has a number of different obstacles that come up, right? There's a lot of procedural rhetoric in the challenge, in the fear of the militia, and in learning about the obstacles that people face so that you can help them overcome them, and drawing attention to the importance of external support being necessary. To grab another one that's really very much at the opposite end of the spectrum to the white nationalist game, we can look at Post-Capitalism, which is a free indie game which simulates the interconnectedness of systems in the world. The goal of this game is to depict how we might reorganize a kind of capitalist present into a post-capitalist utopia. It's not so easy as just flicking a switch and everything being fixed, but we see how different societal issues are connected to one another, and by exploring this system we begin to get to the point where we can understand how to reorganize society over time and sequentially, as opposed to imagining the kind of big picture change. We can kind of imagine what we want society to be, but how to get there and the necessary sequence of changes, really challenging. So it's through the gameplay, right? Through the hiding from the militias, through exploring these systems and seeing how they change, that the games deliver this communicative message. But what I'm going to focus on in this game is when the ideologies aren't as explicit or even obvious after playing it. Sometimes they're extremely hidden and they're subversive, and other times they reflect the values and ideologies of the game developers subconsciously, but yet they remain forms of these representations that can distort our understanding of the world around us. For example, a game, the Landlord's game, was designed in the early 20th century to teach players about the evils of land ownership. You probably know it yourself as Monopoly. We've probably all played Monopoly at some stage, and apart from being not a particularly well-designed game, we can reflect on the fact that as children we weren't thinking about how this game taught us about how land ownership was problematic, and leads to kind of monopoly and inequality, it's more likely that the values that you took from this game were a social celebration of capitalism, and wanting to embody that in your life when you grow up later. There's a number, if you're more interested in this history and these ideas, there's a number of kind of subverted versions of Monopoly that try to return the game to its anti-capitalist roots. Another example of the way that ideologies can be represented in games in a less conscious and less explicit way are the example of barbarians in the game Civilization. And through this we can kind of explore some of the values and attitudes that are present in a game like this. So Civilization is a turn-based grand strategy game. You start out with a single kind of settler, which allows you to settle a city on a tessellated map of the entire world. Taking turns, you build up this city, create military units, and eventually kind of reach end states of conquering the entire world, or perhaps escaping the planet in a spaceship, right? So it depicts from kind of 10,000 BC through to a future over this kind of long time scale. Very, very popular game. An early challenge that you face in Civilization is barbarians. They never develop, or they never build new colonies. They can't be negotiated with like other alliances that you encounter in the game, and they must be destroyed by players as one of the early obstacles in the game. From a game design perspective, what barbarians offer is an obstacle to your immediate expansion that's easy to overcome, that pushes you to develop quickly without throwing you into conflict with one of the other kind of non-playable city-states or nations that you'll encounter later in the game. This is not destroying the barbarians is not presented in Civilization as an ethical choice, but as a necessity. In order to expand and win the game, you have to eliminate these barbarians with whom you can never negotiate. What is the values and attitudes present in a mechanic like this? And we can look at 2017 was just only recently the 25-year anniversary of the High Court ruling on the Marburg case, which threw out the British colonial legal doctrine of terra nullius, a land with a doctrine that stated that Australia was a land without owners. British colonialists justified their land acquisition policies by saying that the Aborigines were too primitive to be actual owners and sovereigns, and that they had no readily identifiable hierarchy or political order with which the British government could recognise or negotiate with. Despite the fact that we know that Australia was kind of comprised of an enormously rich and ancient society. But games like Civilization and similarly games like Settlers of Catan represent the same cultural value towards colonialization. They celebrate and they perpetuate this idea of terra nullius and perhaps this fantasy of terra nullius. In Settlers of Catan is a very popular board game many of you might have played, in which you kind of race against the other players to colonize as much of an island as possible. Although there are no indigenous people on this island, just resources ready to be exploited, although there is a robber icon that can be moved around that prevents further growth in certain areas. Perhaps coincidentally, perhaps subconsciously, the robber icon is painted black in the original versions of the game. So one of the problems with mechanics like this is that they depict the island of Settlers of Catan as terra nullius, land that is empty and that should be colonized. And in society right now, we're currently lacking answers to solve crippling overproduction crises and assorted economic, social, and pandemic-related problems. So we, of course, dream of places where we would start anew, unburdened with debts, right? There's a renewed interest in kind of colonizing planets like Mars to be able to move beyond the kind of restrictions that we have with us. Settlers of Catan is premised on this notion that all civilization since the beginning of the time is about settlement, whereas the game is itself actually about imperial expansion. This critique, I'm going to keep going with this critique by Lorenzo Veracini. The island continent is depicted as this new land, empty as it should be, different from the lands that settlers usually encounter, which are actually filled with the prior claims of indigenous people. Either way, even if the presence of indigenous people is simply disavowed, this absence in the game is significant. After all, settlers are serial and systematic disavowers of indigenous people. So this is a good example, I think, of how games, board games, digital games, perpetuate ideologies and myths about society and history that have kind of present day negative consequences. Another example of an embedded ideology in game can be found in RimWorld. It's not uncommon to hear stories in media and in real life about how men just can't help themselves around beautiful women, and to hear how devastating it is for men to be rejected by the women to whom they are attracted. This kind of societal, this kind of idea of society, this modelling of how the society behaves, is captured in the game RimWorld, which is a colony management sim which defines very, very strict gender roles. In like all digital games, every aspect of the game's behaviour, the system's behaviour, is coded. And as we can see in this example from the game's code, we can have a look at how romance is initiated differently depending on the gender of the sim that you're or the pawn in the game, right? So there's all pawns in the game start out with a base chance of turning any social interaction into a romance attempt, and a minimum threshold of attractiveness and positive opinion for this to happen. In other words, a pawn has to actually like someone and find them attractive in order to then initiate a romantic relationship with them. But there's a random chance of initiation. Female pawns are 8 times less likely to try and start a romantic relationship with other pawns in the game. At the same time, this system that has an enormous impact on how you play. One of the key challenges in RimWorld, you're a bunch of people from a crashed spaceship trying to survive on an extremely harsh planet with constant obstacles being thrown at you, people attacking your colony and things like that. And people get sad, and if they get sad for too long, they have mental breakdowns, which can lead to things like them getting into fights with other pawns or setting everything on fire. So encoded into this game is the behavior of these pawns, right? They're making a claim about, and these aren't aliens, these are meant to be humans. Straight men always find men unattractive. Gay men always find women attractive. There are no bisexual men in this game, but there are bisexual women in this game. All women consider partners the same age and older most attractive. Partners younger than themselves are very unattractive, and partners that are 10 years younger than them are always considered unattractive. There's no old age cutoff for women, but men are designed to assess attractiveness differently, right? So the result of this system is a kind of AI colony in which the pickup lines don't affect the mental happiness or status of a female pawn in the game. There's no penalty to her mood for being constantly barraged by come-ons from the other male pawns in the colony. But the two men, Rob and Boots in this example, feel differently. They have a near permanent mood and relationship penalty because they keep asking her out and they keep getting rebuffed. But it's not really their their fault. They can't stop hitting on her because they're men and because she's just so gosh darn pretty. That's how they've been programmed. So this was an example that got a little bit of media attention when people kind of uncovered how it was that the pawns in this game were being programmed to act and behave in a particular way that perpetuated these kind of myths and inequalities that don't necessarily, I don't think they need to be in the game for this to be an enjoyable and fun game to play, but they also kind of making it an example of how they are making representations about how the world is as kind of matters of coded, quantifiable, objective fact. To move on to another example, we can think about what are some of the ideologies that are embedded in The Sims. Spoke about this a little bit in the previous lecture, where we were looking at how The Sims includes some aspects of society, but it doesn't include others. Careers in The Sims, what I want to focus on is money and how the economy works. Careers in The Sims basically work that you start from the bottom and you can be promoted to the top by going to work in a good mood and regularly attending work. And so once you get to the top, you earn like literally 12,000 simoleons per week, right? This is enough to buy you everything that you need in the game. You can have the most enormous mansion, but just by turning up to work, getting this money, this is enough money to be able to buy the best TV, huge house, and everything else that you ever need, right? And those top jobs are things like interstellar smuggler, triple agent, and the criminal boss. Those are the top paying games. So this game is making a claim about society and families that you can be the richest person in your neighborhood in the kind of world of the game by working 9 to 5. But this obfuscates and omits a lot of realities of capitalism. It's not possible to ever earn $1 billion, right? 1 million seconds. To put the difference between $1 million, which you might be able to earn through playing the game for a lot of time, and $1 billion, which is just a small proportion of the wealth of some people. This guy. 1 million seconds is approximately about 11 days. 1 billion seconds is 31.5 years. The game, by omitting and obfuscating the realities of capitalism and inequality in the society that we live in, makes us more comfortable with the kind of economic situation that we find ourselves in, right? So it's not so much about making explicit claims about the world, but by omitting and by supporting the status quo, that the sim has this embedded ideology of a kind of romanticized, suburban, 9 to 5, 40-hour week life, giving you the every opportunity that you might want. To move on to a kind of new area of critique that builds on some of these ideas, I want to draw on some ideas from Paolo Pedicini, one of the developers at Molly Industria, who speaks about, who discusses how video games, who tries to link the ideas of video games and rationalization. So in sociology, rationalization refers to a process of replacement of traditions, customs, and emotions as motivators of human conduct in favor of quantification and calculation. And so rationalization as a topic of critique really emerged following the Industrial Revolution, where we went from small-scale productions and craftsmanship into factories, the metricization of society at many different levels, and it's a core kind of feature of Marxist critique. Paolo Pedicini notes that video games have a compulsion for aesthetic efficiency and control. Computer games, he argues that computer games are the aesthetic form of rationalization. We can see in games like this is an old version of Civilization, this is a Little Big Workshop, that the play of these games is about reducing the world into series of supply chains and metricizing, creating this kind of world that we have to act as efficiently as possible within to be the most successful. He notes, in strategy and management games, the simulated world is presented as a collection of resources to extract. The landscape, subdivided into spatial units by grids or cells, and the actors inhabiting it are defined by the function that they perform. Right? Paolo Pedicini is one of the developers of the McDonald's video games, and we can see this issue kind of baked into the critique of how this game works as a critique, right? It's this anti-adver game that we spoke about last week that exploits this tradition of play and rationalization to make you complicit in the unethical business practices of companies like McDonald's. In the game, players are uncritically engaging in these practices, abstracted away from the realities of their action, because of this kind of process of rationalization that happens when we're playing these games, where we become solely concerned with efficiency and control. What are the consequences of this when many video games depict the world in this way and are structured around this kind of competition and challenge? Does this affect attitudes maybe towards global warming, where we see the planet as a collection of resources to exploit versus a fragile ecosystem that we have to actively protect? Civilization games are part of a genre called 4X games because they're based on exploring, expanding, exploiting, and exterminating. Civilization 1 in 1991 had climate change as a consequence of creating too much pollution, but that doesn't feature in the later games. Can we imagine solutions to global warming? Does the way that so many games that we play depict the planet as a collection of resources to exploit affect how we can imagine solutions to global warming? Most city building games, with a few exceptions, aren't giving us the tools we need to imagine what cities might look like, right? In games like SimCity, the zoning systems work in a very American style, which prevents mixed use of land. You can require that residential, commercial, and industrial developments are kept separate. Industrial developments create pollution, so people don't want to live near them, and commercial developments want to be near other commercial developments. So you can't build a kind of mixed use walking city in The Sims. Combining this with a very robust tool set for creating roads and public transport links, the result is that cities in SimCity tend towards the game's mechanics and systems push us towards creating an urban sprawl with single-use skyscrapers away from diverse networks of mixed density and sustainable communities. Can we imagine a SimCity that puts people and not cars, and sustainability and not endless growth? First, we're designing a city that's safe to navigate on foot or by bike is not just possible but rewarded, with lower pollution, healthier citizens, and a more desirable city to live in. Where constructing energy-efficient buildings provides long-term in-game benefits like lower energy demands, as well as a chance to learn about real-world trends like passive housing. This could be a SimCity where 100% renewable energy isn't just a nice-to-have, but an essential part of a long-lived city, where the longer you rely on burning fossil fuels, the higher the cost to replace them, and the more rapidly the transition needs to happen to avoid the worst impacts. Often games like this present these as challenges. Similar to Civilization does this, where you can be polluting during the industrial phases of the game, but you can research a technology that's going to solve that problem. That suddenly you're going to be, we don't need to eliminate our carbon emissions right now because we're going to discover a technology that is going to allow us to do this without having to change the way we live. So as an example of a game that I think does this in a really interesting way is Eco. Here's its official trailer. So Eco is this fascinating example of a game that actually includes things, factors like pollution and global warming in its kind of Minecraft-like gameplay, and gives players the opportunity to see these impacts of kind of industrialization and expansion and the exploitation of the natural world's resources, but then also models a collaborative approach, a community-driven approach to solving these problems, while still allowing for advancement and future challenges. So to move on from the example of global warming, we'll kind of come to the last case from this lecture, which is historical representation or historical misrepresentation. Historical video games are a really important medium of participatory public history. The act of playing is, in a very real sense, a dialogue between the player and the designer about what the past was like and how it functioned. Through playing historical games is one of the main ways that many of us come to learn about the ancient worlds, what they must have been like to live in. Right? Again, I've played like 1,000 hours of different games in the Total War series, and I'm very much into Total War. And games like this present the historical world as a collection of resources to extract for the purpose of war. So again, this idea of rationalization and efficiency is very much at the forefront of games in the Total War series. The ancient world is depicted in beautiful maps, but mountains, rivers, and oceans are simply there as obstacles for the movement of troops. But if historical games are one of the primary ways that we engage with history, how are they distorting our understanding of ancient empires, and how are they understanding our understanding of the world in the future? Something in researching for this lecture a few years ago, I found out about Pax Romana, which is a period of nearly 200 years of peace in the Roman Empire. But my kind of understanding of what the Roman Empire was, how it functioned, its economy, and what it meant to be the Roman Empire is built around this idea of warfare, conquer, and expansion from my engagement in the Rome Total War games. To look at a more recent example, we can explore Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which is set in 1873, recounting a fictional story set during the Viking invasion of Britain. You play as a Viking. You can be either a man or a female Viking raider, settling lands in England and fighting against the King of Mercia and other characters like that. Games in the Assassin's Creed series allege a historicalness. Right? A lot of Assassin's Creed games have a discovery tour, which is an educational mode of the game where you can roam the game's historically accurate depiction of cities and learn about history through a series of guided tours. Assassin's Creed Valhalla's narrative director described the game as historically grounded in opposition to other Viking games like God of War. One thing that's worth noting about like Assassin's Creed games is they have this really weird story element where you're actually someone going back into using time travel-y type thing with like one of your ancestors. So if you do certain things that like mess up history, you desynchronize with your ancestors. So you it's kind of historical, but it's also like looking back at memories. Anyway, slavery does not feature in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, beyond a very minor mention of thralls, which were the indentured servants in Norwegian Viking territory in the game. Your settlement in the game, while very nicely diverse, you have characters from Africa, you've got Asian characters, you yourself can be a man or a woman, has no subjugated or enslaved underclass. But the reality is that these Viking raids of England were slave raids, and slave trading was an important, if not essential, part of the Viking economy. Historian Brett Devereaux writes, slavery is presented more or less as something only the initial Norse bad guy does, and then never mentioned again. Imagine the equivalent of a game set in the American South or the Caribbean pre-1865, in which slavery was simply not present at all. Then you have a rough scope of the problem in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. And to the credit of the Assassin's Creed series, Assassin's Creed Black Flag DLC has a downloadable content, has a specific plot where you fight against the slave trade as a black protagonist. So Gameplay in Assassin's Creed Valhalla begins in Norway, creating in the player a need to escape and set sail for a fresh land of England. You settle in unoccupied, save for bandits, Assassin's Creed's version of the barbarian, land on the river. How convenient. You build up your settlement raiding churches or monasteries, but without killing civilians or monks. So the whole ethnic cleansing of the Viking invasion of England is omitted, killing the people who used to live on that nice settlement on the river, killing of all the civilians and the monasteries in those raids. The purpose of these raids is to build up the wealth of your settlement, but in them you only ever take piles of resources locked in giant gold chests, these silly Christian monks hoarding the wealth. Saxons uselessly locking up all of that money in the churches when you are going to be doing good for it to help build farms and improve the lives of the people in your settlement, right? Kind of omitting and obfuscating the reality of these raids as and being profitable for the selling of slaves and the stealing of other forms of resources. After you leave your raid, you can kind of go back afterwards, and everybody's just kind of happy again now that all that wealth isn't being hoarded. The problem with this, and perhaps all historical games, and tying us again back to this idea of games not being political, because that is a debate that doesn't just occur around war games, but also about history in games. Valhalla, Lachlan McLeod writes that Valhalla is this way because it's looking to appeal to certain types of audiences. The game presents itself as historical, but that historicity is more than just a vehicle for reaching a mainstream clientele. It's designed to feel authentic to its community of players and their expectation of what that world was like, while still satisfying a desire for fantasy that will speak to those gamers looking for it. There are elements of history here, but too crisp, too rehearsed to have really grappled with some of the big questions of the past and what it means for the future. And while it's not necessarily Ubisoft's job to educate its players, they have to be responsible for the media that they put in front of them and how it distorts our understanding of these worlds, with consequences for our understanding of the world right now. To return to an idea again from last week, we might think, this is not a pipe. It's a depiction of a pipe, but elements of the pipe are left out in that depiction. And so we might then say, well, this is not a Viking. It depicts some aspects of it. But the problem, I think, with games and the intimacy and the extent of the experience that we can have with them and the realism, the depiction of these games that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to make, is that we don't realize they are not a pipe, that they are not a Viking. We don't know what aspects of this simulation are authentic and true, what has been left out, and what we are not knowing through playing these games. And why is this important today? Well, for one reason, denying slavery and the central role that slavery has had in developing the First World is itself an act of white supremacy. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, as recently as June 2020, claimed that there was no slavery in Australia. How we tell stories about the past can distort our understandings about the present and act as an obstacle to equality, right? Other examples, like who invented the light bulb, right? Typically, this is something that people attribute to the white inventor Thomas Edison, who did invent a version of the first light bulb. But it was the African-American inventor Lewis Latimer who developed the filament that was low cost and robust, that allowed for the light bulb to become part of everyday use around the whole world. It is an act of white supremacy to eliminate Lewis Latimer from how we tell stories of technological innovation and where we got to today. And this obfuscation, these omissions, are an obstacle to modern day equality. And so that's why these kind of omissions in video games, these misrepresentations, and these unassumed assumptions and mechanics are potentially deeply problematic, which we'll be discussing further in the tutorials. And so that brings us to the end of this lecture on cultural rhetoric in games. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Goodbye.